The sky over central Germany was a pale, brittle blue when Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Ritter realized something was wrong with the Americans. It was late winter, 1944. Below his Messerschmitt Bf 109G, a silver river of contrails stretched from horizon to horizon, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators droning east toward Berlin. Around them, specks of sunlight flashed off escort fighters, the same single-engine Mustangs the squadron intelligence officer had sworn could never reach this far into the Reich without running dry. They were still there. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Ritter glanced at his fuel gauge. 1/3 remaining. They had already climbed, attacked, and climbed again over the Ruhr. Standard practice. The American escorts would follow the bombers deep into Germany, then somewhere around Magdeburg or Brunswick they would turn back, short of fuel. That was when experienced Jagdwaffe pilots like him would close in for the kill on the now exposed bombers. But the Mustangs were not turning. 2 of them clung to high cover above his swarm, keeping station like patient hawks. Their silhouettes were unmistakable now, even through a smear of exhaust haze. Long nose, low-drag canopy, broad laminar-flow wings glinting in the cold light. Earlier in the war, pilots had laughed at their British-built cousins over France and the Channel. Now, no one was laughing. He pressed his transmit key. "Fuel state?" he asked, forcing calm into his voice. One after another, the answers came back. Half tanks, a quarter, enough to climb and make a pass or two, then break off and run for home. And still the bombers pushed east, unhurried, as if every factory and rail yard in the Reich were already marked on some invisible map only they could see. Ritter eased his Messerschmitt into a climbing turn, trying to edge around the escorts and cut into the bomber stream. At once, one of the Mustangs rolled toward him, a smooth, almost lazy motion. It did not rush, did not fire, did not even dive. It simply fell into a counter-turn above and behind him, like a shepherd dog sidestepping a sheep that had tried to slip past the line. He cursed under his breath and leveled off. The altimeter read 7,000 meters. The air was thin and cruelly cold. His own Daimler-Benz engine strained, supercharger howling as it fought for every scrap of oxygen. The Mustang's Merlin seemed almost indifferent, its 12 cylinders still pulling cleanly, the big, 4-bladed propeller biting into the air. He checked his mapboard. If he broke off now, he could just make it back to his home field in Saxony with a slim reserve. But ahead, the bomber stream was bending northeast, straight toward Berlin. It was impossible. Every briefing, every performance figure, every calculation from the technical officers said the same thing. A single-engine escort fighter could not fly from English bases, cross the North Sea, accompany bombers to Berlin, fight and then return. The distances and fuel loads did not permit it. Even the heavy twin-engine Bf 110 and Me 410 night fighters had struggled at such ranges, and yet the Mustangs stayed. They curbed and wheeled above the bombers with all the easy confidence of birds over their own roost. One pair dove to shred a staffel of Focke-Wulfs that had dared to attack from below. Another element slid across the high sun, weaving deliberately, watching, not hunting for quick kills, guarding a column of air power that now stretched from East Anglia to the gates of Berlin itself. Ritter felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with altitude. If the Americans could put fighters here with this much fuel in their tanks, then every formation of bombers from now on would arrive with teeth. No more unprotected returns, no more safe ambushes against exhausted gunners. The distance of the Reich, the comfort of deep interior airspace that had once been their shield, meant nothing anymore. He tightened his harness and told himself he would make one more pass. Honor demanded it, habit too. For years, the rhythm had been the same. Scramble to intercept, climb, make a high-speed attack, then slip away before the escorts could catch up. The Reich's defense depended on that pattern. He rolled his fighter gently toward the shining river of bombers and saw, with a jolt, that a third Mustang now sat ahead of him at his altitude, slightly offset. It had appeared without hurry, sliding into place in a shallow climbing turn. Its pilot knew exactly where he was going to be. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Ritter did not attack. He could not. The geometry was all wrong, and he knew too well what happened to pilots who pressed into bad angles against these new escorts. The Mustang's pilot dipped a wing slightly, almost like a nod, then held position. In that small, precise movement, Ritter felt the balance of the air war shift. The Americans were no longer guests at the edges of the Reich, raiding Hamburg today, Bremen tomorrow, then retreating out of range. They were here over the very heart of Germany, with fighters whose endurance had quietly rewritten the map. Their bomber crews, once thin-faced men who spoke in whispers of fatal odds, now looked out through plexiglass noses, knowing a line of lethal, long-legged guardians would fly with them all the way to target and back. The question was simple, and for the Jagdwaffe terrifying. How had the Americans managed it? To answer that, one must go back not to the frozen contrails over Berlin in 1944, but to a drawing board in deep California 4 years earlier, when the idea of a long-range escort fighter was still little more than a desperate hope. In the autumn of 1939, when war returned to Europe, the United States Army Air Corps found itself in an awkward position. Its strategic thinking, under men like General Henry Hap Arnold, had embraced the concept of daylight precision bombing. Armadas of 4-engine bombers would penetrate deep into enemy airspace, strike factories, rail hubs, and synthetic fuel plants, and cripple an industrial war machine without the need for massive ground forces. What the doctrine lacked was a hard, unfashionable detail: how to protect those bombers. On the way, the War Department's early thinking, shaped by experience in the 1930s, assumed heavily armed bombers could fight their way through. Tight formations of B-17s, bristling with Browning machine guns, would present a forest of fire no attacking fighter could penetrate. Some in the Air Corps hierarchy even argued that escort fighters were unnecessary at long range, or that twin-engined heavy fighters like the Lockheed P-38 Lightning could fill the role if needed. Reality over Europe dismantled those illusions just as coldly as high-altitude air-stripped heat from exposed skin. When the 8th Air Force began regular bombing raids into occupied France and the Western Reich in 1942 and early 1943, its existing fighters, the Bell P-39, Curtiss P-40, and early Republic P-47, could only escort for part of the journey. Beyond a certain radius, usually over Western Germany, the bombers would be on their own. There, experienced Luftwaffe units waited, climbing in disciplined formations to tear into the unescorted boxes of bombers with 30mm cannon. Losses mounted. Over Schweinfurt and Regensburg in 1943, over Bremen, Kassel, and Münster, entire groups came back with half their aircraft missing, or sometimes worse. Crews began to talk quietly of 1,000-yard stares and the sort of arithmetic every combat aviator learns. 25 missions required for a tour, each mission with a given chance of death. A 1 in 4 survival rate was not propaganda. It was lived reality. The answer lay not only in tactics, but in engineering. An escort fighter fast enough to tangle with Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, rugged enough to fight at high altitude, and, most important, able to stay with the bombers from their North Sea crossing to the furthest targets in central and eastern Germany, then shepherd them home again. That fighter did not originate in an American staff requirement, but in an urgent British request, and a company that initially had no engine to put in its sleek new airframe. In 1940, the Royal Air Force faced a crisis of its own. The Battle of Britain had bled its fighter squadrons, and production of Spitfires and Hurricanes struggled to keep pace with losses and expansion. The British Purchasing Commission in the United States approached North American aviation with a question. Could they manufacture the Curtiss P-40 under license? James Dutch Kindleberger, head of North American, made a bolder offer. Rather than build an outdated design, his engineers could create a new fighter from scratch in just a few months, one that would equal or surpass the P-40 in performance. It was a gamble of the kind that war often demands, trading short-term safety for long-term advantage. The result, rolled out in record time, was the NA-73, soon to receive its RAF name. Mustang. In its first incarnation, the Mustang was not the sleek, Merlin-powered thoroughbred that would later roam over Berlin. It carried an Allison V1710 engine whose single-stage supercharger struggled above medium altitudes. Below 3,000 meters, it was fast, maneuverable, and well-behaved. Above 5,000, its performance faded as the air thinned and the engine choked. Yet even this early version concealed two traits that would eventually make the long-range escort possible. The first was its wing. North American engineers, drawing on research from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, designed a laminar-flow airfoil that moved the thickest part of the wing further aft than in conventional designs. In simple terms, this reduced drag at high speeds, allowing the aircraft to slice through the air more efficiently. Combined with careful attention to surface finish, flush riveted skin, smooth transitions between fuselage and canopy, the Mustang wasted less energy in turbulence and shock. The second was its capacity for fuel. The clean, low-drag wing allowed the designers to build internal fuel tanks of significant volume without ruining performance. Later versions would add a fuselage tank behind the cockpit, and of course, there was nothing in the airflow that prevented external drop tanks from being hung beneath the wings. From the start, the airframe was a canvas on which range could be painted, if only a suitable engine and fuel system were mated to it. The British, whose bombers flew mostly at night and at medium altitudes, initially used the early Mustangs for tactical reconnaissance and low-level attack. The Americans, preoccupied with other projects and still committed to the belief that their existing fighters would suffice, relegated the P-51 to specialized roles: dive bomber, photo reconnaissance platform, sometimes a ground attack aircraft. It took a kind of transatlantic heresy to unlock its true potential. By late 1942, some in the RAF had already experimented with marrying their standard Rolls-Royce Merlin engine to foreign airframes. The Merlin, with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, maintained power far better at high altitude than the Allison. Engineers at Rolls-Royce's experimental shop at Hucknall, Nottinghamshire, looked at the Mustang's slippery lines and wondered what would happen if they replaced its heart. The answer, when the first Mustang X prototypes flew in early 1943, was startling. With a Merlin 305 engine installed, the aircraft leaped through the transonic regime with new authority. Climb rates improved dramatically. At the altitudes where American heavy bombers flew, 6,000 to 8,000 meters, the re-engined Mustang was faster than the German fighters sent to intercept it. When Packard in the United States began license building Merlin engines as the V1650, the way was clear for mass production. But engines and wings alone did not give the P-51 its 8-hour legs. That came from a series of decisions that, at the time, many in the American fighter community resisted. Fighter pilots, by temperament and training, tend to value agility and raw speed over endurance. The idea of strapping large, drag-inducing external tanks to a sleek aircraft offended instinct. Drop tanks could be jettisoned before combat, but until then, they spoiled roll rate, reduced acceleration, and made fighters more vulnerable if surprised. Moreover, senior officers remembered the First World War and early interwar doctrine, fighters as pure machines of the dogfight, closely tied to fronts and bases. Long-range escort seemed an ungainly hybrid, part fighter, part flying fuel tank. Yet, the mathematics of attrition in 1943 forced a harsh reckoning. Analysts at 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe, poring over loss charts from the Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions and others, could see the pattern. Bombers were being mauled precisely in those portions of their track where escorts had to turn back. The Luftwaffe understood the same charts from the other side. German controllers would hold back fresh interceptors until the telltale moment when thunderbolts and lightnings peeled away, then hurl their fighters at now isolated bomber groups. The solution demanded a fighter that could take off from English fields with external tanks full, climb to join the bomber stream over the North Sea, cruise economically to deep targets like Leipzig or Berlin, fight on arrival, then either escort the damaged and stragglers home or at least clear a corridor for them through the worst of German defenses. The revised Mustang, with Packard Merlin, laminar wing, and generous internal fuel, was almost perfectly suited, if only one accepted the indignity of bolting on more fuel. By the winter of 1943 to 1944, factory lines in Inglewood and Dallas were pushing out P-51B and C models in increasing numbers. These aircraft carried roughly 570 liters of fuel in the wings and a further 360 in a fuselage tank when fitted. Under each wing, standard hardpoints could carry drop tanks of 375 liters or, later, even larger paper tanks made of impregnated cardboard. With both internal and external fuel topped off, a Mustang could take off with over 1,600 liters aboard, flown with care at lean mixture and economical power settings that gave it a combat radius on the order of 1,000 to 1,100 kilometers, enough with a margin to reach Berlin, loiter briefly in the target area, and return, on paper. Turning that paper range into lived reality demanded something more than numbers, a shift in mentality. Pilots, accustomed to short, violent sorties over North Africa or the Channel, had to learn a new discipline of fuel management, cruising at reduced power instead of racing at maximum continuous, climbing in long, shallow spirals rather than brutal zooms that guzzled precious liters, accepting 8-hour missions that left backs stiff, eyes burning, and bladders aching, yet demanded vigilance from first contact to last. In January and February of 1944, as converted P-51s began to trickle into the 8th Air Force's fighter groups, commanders like General James Doolittle and his subordinates rewrote escort tactics around this new endurance. Gone was the rigid doctrine that fighters must stay welded to bomber formations like bodyguards. Instead, Mustangs were directed to sweep ahead, above and around the bomber stream, hunting down German interceptors as they formed or climbed. When conditions demanded, they dropped down to lash at airfields, rail yards, and any other target that sustained the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the sky. To German pilots, used to seeing escorts abandon the bombers at predictable turning points, the change was at first merely puzzling. A few raids came deeper than expected. Thunderbolts appeared over Hanover, or P-38s over Münster. Past what had been their usual limit, intelligence officers argued about improved fuel management, about new tankage, about possible forward bases. Then, on the 6th of March, 1944, the argument ended in a single, brutal demonstration. That morning, more than 730 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force crossed the Dutch coast, bound for Berlin itself. The German capital had suffered night raids by the RAF before, but never a full-scale daylight attack by American fortresses. Every operational Jagdgeschwader within reach was scrambled. Controllers packed the air with Bf-109s and FW-190s, determined to break the raid as far west as possible. They found, instead of the familiar short-legged escorts, long-nosed P-51s still sitting atop the formations east of Hanover, then again near Magdeburg, and again in the last run-in toward Berlin. Some Mustangs, coming off earlier sweeps, even plunged down to strafe training fields on the way home, an unthinkable extravagance of fuel for the Bf-109 pilots who saw it. Over Berlin, as Ritter and others like him tried to climb into position for the sort of head-on attacks that had once shattered bomber boxes, they found themselves bounced and bracketed instead. The familiar geometry of advantage, German fighters diving out of the sun onto battered, escortless bombers, had inverted. In interrogation rooms after the war, more than one former Luftwaffe officer would recall that day in similar words, the day they first saw American single-engine fighters circling over Berlin, and understood in their bones if not yet on paper, that the strategic balance had swung. For Ritter, at 7,000 meters with his fuel needle creeping toward the red, the realization was more immediate and more intimate. He could not shake the Mustang pacing him. Every small turn he made to edge closer to the bombers was matched. Every attempt to feint back and then roll in for a head-on pass found a silver-nosed shape. Sliding across his path, the escort pilot did not waste ammunition. He did not need to. His very presence was enough. After long minutes of this silent fencing, Ritter broke away. He rolled his Messerschmitt onto a heading for home, nose just below the horizon for the most economical cruise. Mixture leaned as far as he dared. In the mirror of his canopy, the bombers and their escorts dwindled into distant streaks against the brittle sky, still pressing east toward a city whose factories, rail yards, and synthetic fuel plants could no longer hide behind distance. For the first time since he had climbed into a fighter cockpit as a young man in 1940, he felt not just danger, but a kind of structural helplessness. He and his comrades could still fight, still kill, still die bravely, but they could no longer assume that the vastness of German airspace would force the enemy to fight on terms favorable to the defenders. The Americans had, in metal and fuel and measured laminar curves, quietly erased that comfort. It would take months, further raids, and yet more blood for the full consequences to unfold. The refineries at Leuna and the synthetic fuel plants at Merseburg and Pörlitz would feel the first concentrated blows. Pilot training, already shortened and hurried, would falter as fuel supplies dwindled. Green replacements would climb into fighters with just a handful of hours, only to meet veteran Mustangs, whose pilots had already flown dozens of deep penetration missions. But up there in the cold March air, watching contrails stretch unbroken all the way to Berlin, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Ritter understood the essence before any staff officer wrote it down in a report. The Reich was no longer far away, and the P-51 Mustang, with its improbable 8-hour reach, had made the very heart of Germany just another point on a planner's map in an English operations room, a dot that could be circled in red grease pencil with the calm assurance that American fighters would be there when the bomb bay doors opened. Ritter's Messerschmitt droned westward alone, a small, exhausted insect against the pale winter sky. The engine note settled into a rough, familiar hum. Oil temperature steady, boost needle in the green. His gloved hand, cramped from constant corrections during the combat phase, finally relaxed on the throttle. But his mind did not. On the ground, the briefing officers had spoken of range boxes and probable escort limits. Colored chalk lines on a map had divided the Reich into zones of relative safety. West of the Rhine, escorts were guaranteed. Between the Rhine and the Weser, likely. East of the Elbe, they said, American single-engine fighters could not possibly maintain combat presence. There, beyond those scribbled lines, the Luftwaffe would still rule the upper air. Up here, those reassuring bands of color meant nothing. He glanced over his left shoulder. Far behind, barely visible now, the contrails arched onward into the east. Somewhere at the head of that river, bombers with white stars on their wings would already be aligning for their bomb runs. Somewhere above and around them, Mustangs would be sliding into their attack patterns, ready to meet any German fighter that tried to climb from fields around Wittenberg, Jüterbog, or the capital itself. Ritter had imagined that moment differently. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For years, the air above central Germany had been a kind of reserve, a hinterland where German pilots might still dictate terms. They would climb into the thin air, secure in the knowledge that the enemy's escorts would have to turn for home before the decisive point. The Reich's geography was an ally. The sheer breadth of its territory imposed a limit on foreign aggression. Now he had seen those limits ignored. As the fuel needle sagged below the quarter-full mark, he thought of the technical officers back at the field, of the slow, methodical men who had recited endurance figures for the P-51 based on externally reported tankage and assumed consumption. They had been wrong, but not because they could not multiply liters and kilometers. They had been wrong because they had failed to imagine what this new aircraft could become when its owners were willing to bend doctrine around it. On the other side of the war, across the North Sea, in a cold briefing room at an English base, that bending had already begun, months before Ritter ever saw a Mustang over Berlin. Major Jack Lawson, of the United States Army Air Forces, stood in front of a blackboard, chalk in hand, while a room full of pilots in woolen sheepskin jackets watched him draw circles over a map of Europe. Lawson had the lean, hollow-cheeked look of a man who had already flown too many missions and who knew the arithmetic of loss as well as any staff officer. His hair had gone prematurely grey at the temples, and the creases around his eyes were tinted red from the wind and gasoline fumes that came with hours at altitude. "Here is the old limit," he said, drawing a wide arc that curved roughly from Bremen down toward Kassel, then east of Frankfurt. "That's where our P-Thunderbolts and P-38s had to call it quits last summer. They could reach further on paper, but not with enough fuel in hand to fight and still bring you home." He let the chalk rest at that line for a moment. More than one man in the room had left friends beyond it. More than one had sat helpless in a cockpit as German fighters pounced on bomber formations whose escorts had just rolled away on schedule. "Now," Lawson continued, drawing a second arc further east, "this is what the new P-51 fully tanked can actually do if you manage it right. Over the Zuider Zee by the time you reach formation. Climb on external tanks. Switch to internal only when you're at altitude near the enemy coast. Burn the fuselage tank first, then the wings. Drop the externals only when you're about to join battle." He underlined a point far inside Germany, then pressed the chalk down, making a small white crater. "Gentlemen, this point here is Berlin. With two 375-liter drop tanks and full internal fuel, you can be over this city at bomber altitude, with enough juice to tangle for a while and still get back to England with a safety margin. It will not be comfortable, it will not be forgiving if you make stupid decisions. But it is possible." There was a silence in the room as the pilots absorbed that. Some looked skeptical. The P-51 had arrived only recently, and men who had grown up with Thunderbolts and Lightnings had learned to distrust optimistic range charts. Others stared, not at the map, but at that small chalk mark representing the German capital, as if seeing not a city, but a promise. "High Command wants us to think about the P-51 not just as another fighter," Lawson said. "They want us to think of it as a long arm. You're not just going out to meet bandits over the frontier anymore. You are going to live with these bombers, from wheels up to wheels down, as far as humanly and mechanically possible." He did not mention that some senior officers had opposed the very tactics he was now explaining. Old habits die hard. There were still colonels who insisted that fighters should stay tethered tightly to bomber formations, turning only when the bombers turned, never diving away in pursuit of Germans, unless those Germans were already in the act of firing. The fear was understandable. Let fighters roam free, and they might chase personal glory instead of doing the dull, essential work of protection. But by 1944, reality had forced a revision. General James Doolittle, given command of the 8th Air Force's fighters early that year, had issued a blunt instruction. The job of his units was not merely to protect bombers reactively. It was to break the Luftwaffe proactively, to hunt and kill German fighters wherever they could be found. Keeping escorts welded tight to formations might reassure bomber crews, but it forfeited the initiative. The P-51's range made a new kind of aggression possible. It allowed squadrons to go looking for the interceptors before they ever reached the bombers, to loiter around known assembly points, to prowl the approaches to German airfields like wolves waiting outside a den. Lawson understood the logic instinctively. He also understood the price. Free-ranging escorts would mean more fuel burned at combat power, more chances to get separated or lost over hostile territory, more risks for the men in that room. He set the chalk down and turned to face them. "I'm not going to pretend this will be easy," he said. "You will be strapped into those cockpits for 7, sometimes 8 hours. Your legs will go numb. Your eyes will blur. You will be tempted to snap at any target of opportunity, just to feel alive again. He paused. But if we do this right, if we use this airplane the way it was intended, the Germans will not just lose fighters, they will lose the ability to contest our bombers at all. And when that happens, the refineries at Merseburg, the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, the marshalling yards feeding their front, those will all be within reach, day after day, without their having any hope of throwing us back. He did not mention Berlin again. He did not have to. Weeks later, as dawn broke over the hardstand, Lawson climbed the ladder into his own Mustang and felt the familiar mix of dread and purpose settle onto his shoulders like a second harness. The ground crew had already done their work. The olive-drab skin of the aircraft gleamed with fresh oil and frost where condensed mist had frozen overnight. Under each wing, a pale, bulbous external tank hung from its pylon, streaked with pencil marks where a mechanic had noted capacity and fill times. The Merlin coughed, sputtered, then caught with a throaty roar as he hit the starter, and the prop swung through its first revolutions. The nose vibrated, the cockpit shuddered, and the all-too-familiar smell of high-octane fuel, hot oil and exhaust filled the confined space. He settled his headset over his ears, checked his oxygen mask, and listened to the clipped, almost bored voices of tower and flight leaders as they cleared squadrons for takeoff. This mission's target would not be announced over the radio. The maps in their kneeboards already told them enough. Berlin, synthetic fuel facilities and rail junctions that fed the capital, and beyond it, the Eastern Front. He throttled up when his turn came, feeling the Mustangs surge forward, the tail lifting and the runway blurring beneath the spinning prop. Seconds later, he was airborne, climbing into a sky streaked by hundreds of other contrails as fighters and bombers converged on predetermined rendezvous points. The first hours passed, as they always did on long escorts: climb, form, settle into cruising power. The drop tanks did their work, the needles on the wing tank gauges barely moving, while the externals dribbled away their contents. Conversation on the radio was sparse. The air at 5,000 meters was cold, but manageable. The landscape below was still friendly. English fields, then the grey-green of the North Sea, then the patchwork of occupied Holland. Only beyond the Zuiderzee did the true length of the mission reveal itself. Time dilated in the thin air. Minutes stretched and twisted around small routines, a glance at the fuel gauge, a brief check of engine instruments, an adjustment of the gun sight brightness as the sun climbed higher. Occasionally, a formation of bombers loomed ahead, and Lawson's flight would slide into their assigned escort positions, counting turrets and marking group codes with weary professional interest. As they passed over the German border, flak began to reach up in half-hearted bursts, dark blossoms far below whose fragments rarely reached the altitudes where fighters and bombers flew. German radar stations had already plotted the incoming streams. Controllers far beneath the cloud layer were vectoring their interceptors into the path. Lawson checked his fuel again. External tanks nearly dry, internal still full enough to give him confidence that, barring catastrophe, he would see his home field again before the day was done. He flexed his fingers inside thick gloves and scanned the upper hemisphere of sky, eyes trained to catch the faintest aberration in the blue, a darker speck moving against the grain, the subtle crossing of a contrail that did not belong. Against that tense quiet of watchfulness, the first German attack was almost anticlimactic. A call came over the radio. "Bandits, 12 o'clock, high," and tiny pencil strokes of contrail appeared above and ahead, tooling toward the bomber stream from a slightly offset angle. Focke-Wulfs, probably, or high-altitude Bf-109s with special engines tuned for rarefied air. Lawson did not need to think. Training and countless previous sorties had already dug the path of his reactions. "Red flight, with me," he said, and rolled the Mustang gently to starboard, climbing toward the oncoming streaks. His external tanks, now nearly empty, shook and juddered under the wings. At the right moment, he reached down, flicked the release toggles, and felt the brief, liberating twitch as the tanks fell away. The Mustang leapt slightly, freed of the drag and weight, and the controls felt sharper under his hand. He did not know, at that instant, that somewhere far below, a German pilot in a Messerschmitt was watching exactly that movement and feeling the world tilt under him. He did not know that, to the man in grey, the dropping of those tanks over central Germany, this far from England, would seem an act of impossible extravagance. He knew only that his job was about to begin. The closing speed between fighters approaching head-on at combat velocity is brutal. At 6,000 meters, with both sides above 500 kilometers per hour, the window for identification, alignment, and firing shrinks to seconds. Lawson had long ago learned to trust the lead computing gun sight and to let years of gunnery practice guide his hands. As the first dark shapes of Bfe-109s resolved themselves against the sun, he pushed the nose slightly down to build speed, felt the Merlin's song deepen and thicken as the propeller bit harder into the air and squeezed the trigger. 84 Browning .50 caliber machine guns. That was the combined weight of fire when a full squadron of Mustangs opened up, did what they had been designed to do. Tracer lines reached out in pale, straight rods. One Messerschmitt caught a fraction too long in Lawson's sight ring, spasmed. A panel flew off its wing. A bloom of flame burst from its engine cowling. It slewed violently, then tumbled, pieces scattering across the sky like burning confetti. Lawson did not follow it down. He pulled up instead, rolled out, and looked for the next threat, calculating, without conscious thought, how much fuel each from the top dive or climbing turn would cost him. Behind him, the bombers droned on, massive and indifferent, their bomb bays still closed. Their crews, hunched over Norden sights and radio sets, saw only flashes of light as fighters on both sides clashed in brief, savage bursts. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On the ground in Germany, far from these dogfights, the consequences of such missions would soon become visible in more than wreckage and vapor trails. In the industrial towns of Saxony and Thuringia, in places whose names had rarely appeared in foreign newspapers, before the war, workers sheltered in air raid tunnels while the roofs above them shook under the impact of thousands of kilograms of explosives. Synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Berlin, constructed at enormous cost to convert coal into gasoline, erupted in great columns of smoke when their delicate towers and cracking units were struck. Rail yards at Halle and Dresden, once neat geometries of steel and signal lights, became snarled heaps of twisted track. German engineers struggled heroically to patch, reroute, and improvise. They laid temporary tracks around craters, set up emergency pumping stations, cannibalized half-ruined machinery to keep at least some fraction of output flowing. But month by month, the arithmetic of destruction outran the arithmetic of repair. For the Luftwaffe, the situation was particularly dire. Fighters like Ritter's Messerschmitt did not run on faith and courage. They ran on high-octane aviation fuel whose refining demanded stable, centralized facilities. When those facilities burned, the fuel, reaching forward airfields, thinned to a trickle. Training flights were cut. Young pilots went into combat with only a fraction of the hours their predecessors had enjoyed. At the same time, the P-51's long reach allowed American units to harass German fighter bases directly. On the way home from deep escort missions, squadrons sometimes dropped down to strafe airfields whose locations and layouts had been carefully studied from reconnaissance photographs. Parked aircraft were shredded on the ground. Maintenance crews, already overworked, were killed at their own workplaces. Runways were pitted with craters that took yet more labor and scarce materials to repair. Ritter would feel the narrowing of his world in small, practical ways. Where once he had spent hours each week in practice flights, rehearsing new tactics or simply shaking the stiffness out of his hands and shoulders with steep turns and climbing spirals, now he found his cockpit time-rationed. Where once he might have had a fresh engine installed promptly after reaching recommended hours, now he flew machines whose maintenance logs showed red ink notations and extended intervals. He adapted. Men at war always do. For as long as their strength holds, he flew as directed, rose when the sirens wailed, chased contrails, dove through flak, watched friends fall, and returned when he could to strip off his helmet and stand, sweating and shaking, on a strip of battered tarmac that lay at the edge of fields burned brown by fuel shortages. But the immense space in which he had once maneuvered, both literally and psychologically, had shrunk. He no longer believed that some distant line over central Germany marked the limit of his enemy's reach. He had seen Mustangs above Berlin. He had watched them loiter where no foreign fighter had any right to be. And he had broken away not because fate suddenly turned against him, but because his own machine ran dry first. On the other side of the lines, in the orderly confusion of an American debriefing tent, Lawson sat with a lukewarm cup of coffee in his hand, listening as an intelligence officer asked the same questions he always asked after missions. Enemy types encountered? Mostly 109s today, Lawson answered, his voice hoarse from hours on the oxygen mask. A few 190F models trying to come up from below. They did not stick around long once we got into them. Tactics. The first batch tried to come in from 11 o'clock high, same as always. They didn't expect us to still be there this far east. I saw at least two who looked like they tried to break off early when they realized we weren't turning for home. He paused, remembering the brief, almost comical moment when one Messerschmitt had seemed to hesitate in the sky, as if its pilot had been struck by an unwelcome thought. If the Americans were here, with enough fuel to fight, where could he possibly go that they could not follow? Later on, Lawson continued, we hit a field southeast of Magdeburg on the return leg, a dozen or so birds on the ground. A couple tried to take off, but we were already in their pattern. They never got their wheels up. The intelligence officer scribbled notes, then looked up. Fuel stayed on return. More comfortable than I would like to admit, Lawson said dryly. I trimmed and leaned according to plan. We're starting to prove the math right. He did not mention how, on the long flight back over the North Sea, with the Merlin throttled back and the engine note turned to a sleep-inducing drone, his thoughts had drifted unbidden to the men in German cockpits, to the ones who had broken away from the bomber stream with their own fuel needles scraping the bottom of the gauge. He did not indulge in pity. War did not allow much space for that. But he understood, in a way that staff charts could not fully capture, what the new range of his aircraft meant for those on the other side. It meant there was now no sanctuary of distance left to them. From that March raid onward, each deep penetration into the German interior repeated the lesson. Some days, the Luftwaffe managed to mass interceptors in sufficient numbers to draw blood. There were still vicious battles on cloudy mornings over Leipzig or sunny afternoons over eastern Bavaria when Mustangs fell in fire and parachutes bloomed in the thin air from both sides. But the pattern had shifted. German fighters now had to fight from the moment the bombers crossed the frontier until the last racks clanged empty over distant targets, always under the eye of an escort that did not fade away at some comforting imaginary line. Every sortie they flew cost fuel they increasingly could not afford. Every replacement pilot they sent up had less training time and fewer chances of survival. By the end of 1944, Luftwaffe staff officers who once spoke confidently of air control over the Reich's interior used different words in their memoranda. They spoke of holding actions, of local successes, of temporary disruptions to the American offensive. Between the lines, anyone who had ever flown a fighter could read the truth. The P-51 Mustang, with its marriage of laminar-flow wing, Merlin power, internal tankage, and those ungainly but essential drop tanks under its wings, had done what no one on the German side had believed an enemy single-engine fighter could do. It had turned Berlin from a distant stronghold into just another mission leg. It had taken the abstract idea of range, numbers on a chalkboard, and turned it into an 8-hour day in a cramped cockpit, an 8-hour chain in which no link could be allowed to fail. For Lawson, and for the men in his squadron, That chain was forged afresh every time they climbed the ladder into their Mustangs. For Ritter and for his comrades, it was something felt as a tightening around the lungs, as a new, unwelcome pressure at the edges of every map and every fuel calculation. In the end, numbers would tell the story. Sortie rates dropping on the German side, pilot losses rising, mission effectiveness charts for the 8th Air Force bending upward. But in the moment, high above the grey patchwork of a wounded continent, it came down to something more visceral. One pilot would look up from a Messerschmitt cockpit and see an enemy fighter still pacing him deep over his own capital, and know that the old geography of safety had been erased. Another, huddled in a Mustang, with the North Sea wind leaking in around the canopy seals, would glance at his fuel gauge over Berlin and realize, with a tired, grim satisfaction, that he still had enough in his tanks not only to fight, but to go home. The war in the air was far from over. There would be new tactics, desperate counters, and tragic losses on both sides before it ended. But the day those long-legged escorts first circled above Berlin like patient, relentless hawks, something fundamental had shifted. The Luftwaffe's pilots might not yet have the words for it. Their fuel gauges did. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today.